Hey folks, so I wanted to do a quick video on Bill Clinton being trash. Thought it was easier just to talk it through rather than sort of giving you documented evidence because I wanted to be really clear on where I stood with him. I don't care about Monica Lewinsky. I really don't, other than it showing just sort of a lack of complete sort of common sense and discipline. You're in the White House, you know, you have the affairs that you want, but just in that fashion, it was just tacky, right? And with who? Just tacky. So anyway, and some sort of lack of really self-discipline and self-control. I have an issue with that, but that's just a matter of my me being a little bit of a judging dumbness, right? I just don't like stupidity. I just thought it was stupid. But anyway, that aside, this is really about the implications of Bill Clinton's policy decisions and the fact that I think that Bill Clinton is a white supremacist. I'll break this down. I think that we often think that white supremacists don't want to be anywhere near us, right? I don't think that's necessarily the reality. To think about it this way, you were living on plantations and you had people that very much believed in white supremacy and they loved having you around, right? They wanted your grandmama on the syrup box, right? They wanted black women taking care of their children. They wanted black women in their beds. They wanted black men in their fields. They wanted black men building their homes. They don't hate us, right? This isn't a matter of hate in the way that you think it is. It's not a matter of aversion, right? They have an aversion towards us. Some people do, but that's not really what at the heart of it, that's not what it's about. It really is this need to dominate and consume you in particular ways. So when I say consume, I don't mean literally eating, even though that actually has been done to us in the past by white supremacists. I'm talking about consuming your culture, consuming your labor, consuming your intellect, anything that it can use in order to bolster and feed itself. That's what it wants to do to us, right? So sometimes that means having you close. Sometimes it means even marrying you, right? Procreating with you. Sometimes that means making sure that you are in a weakened state so that you are unable to collect yourselves and to really understand what's happening and what the intentions are. There's lots of things that sort of go into making sure that you are an inexhaustible source of income, power, and wealth for people. So anyway, with that being said, I'm going to get to Bill Clinton. And Bill Clinton did a series of things that conservative Republicans could never do, right? The reason why they hate him has to do with other things. It has nothing to do with him being a liberal. That's what you think it is. But there's a real class thing with Bill Clinton, right? What Bill Clinton stands for, just in terms of he is the first white trash president. He wasn't the first black president. He was the first white trash president. And there is a real hate for white trash in this country that no one talks about. I've actually talked about this with a white male friend of mine. And he was saying, we were having this conversation. It's actually an ongoing conversation. This is a really good friend of mine. We've been having this ongoing conversation about race for probably a good 5 years now. I've known him for about 10 years. But, really getting to a point in our friendship where we could actually have these honest conversations. And it was a conversation about how white people really hate poor white people, stupid white people, right? They're usable. And that's what you have to understand. The white supremacists will use anything and anybody. They'll smile in your face and you think that you're friends and you think all things are okay. But all the while, they hate you. But, if you were useful to them, you're going to stick around. They're going to keep you around and you never will know that they hate you until you find yourself bound up and in some sort of inescapable form of exploitation. And that's what happens to poor whites, right? Poor whites are used as a military force with our police force, in our actual military. Their numbers are needed in order for the white supremacists who run this whole thing to be able to keep doing what they're doing because there's not enough of them, right? So Bill Clinton actually came from that lower class of whites. He grew up very poor, and he is hated, I believe, because of that being his background, right? We've had, one other president that people felt the same way about, who was Andrew Jackson, or Andrew Johnson. It was one of the Andrews that, people, I think it was Andrew Jackson, who was kind of tearing up the White House. I mean, he was playing like just white trash in the White House and, look into it. He had people coming in and animals were coming in and out of the White House. He was just garbage, right? So anyway, he was another one that's, really disrespected because of this background. this idea of white trash and being sort of not worthy as a white person. It really matters to white people more than we know. It's a conversation that we as people who aren't white aren't really privy to, but happens with white folks, right? So anyway, Bill Clinton is actually hated for that reason. My problem with Bill Clinton is, as a black person, and why I believe Bill Clinton is trash, is he's at the funeral yesterday of John Lewis, and he's there at this funeral, and he is making sure to make a white supremacist political point that a lot of people do not understand what's happening if you don't understand public policy and Bill Clinton's entire career, right? He's always sort of dog whistling, right, in these weird ways too, to white supremacy, pandering for their votes. So one of the things that Bill Clinton did yesterday is he's talking about, he invokes the name of Kwame Toure, or Stokely Carmichael, right, who became Kwame Toure, who was one of the organizers or the leaders of the civil rights movement, and he was also became a Pan-Africanist. His politics evolved to Pan-Africanism, and he and John Lewis actually were partners in SNCC, right? And what happened was Stokely Carmichael saw the writing on the wall, and he saw that, these people are not operating in good faith. This isn't a matter of ignorance, or they just don't know, or they're not used to us, or this is an older generation, and things are just going to get better if we have enough marriage and sex and live next door to each other and go to school together. He was seeing how deeply entrenched this thing actually is, right? And he became sort of more and more revolutionary and more militant. And what happened to John Lewis is he became more conservative. He talked about integration. He wanted to, he started sort of talking about all rights instead of black rights. And as a matter of fact, I'm not going to disrespect John Lewis at all, because I think he had made a really important contribution as a young man to the civil rights movement. But as an older man, there isn't much that we can point to as far as legislation that John Lewis actually passed that was actually really progressive for black people in particular. He talked a lot about LGBT rights and women's rights, but black rights was something that he kind of stayed away from. And I argue that he stayed away from it because it endeared him to the majority community to do so. So with that being said, Bill Clinton gets to the funeral yesterday, and he's talking, and he decides that he has to point out at this particular political moment that we're in that John Lewis's way of being an accommodationist and integrationist was preferable to Stokely Carmichael's more militant Pan-Africanism. And that's basically to tell you and to signal for everyone that the way that he likes his black people are to be people who acquiesce to white supremacy in particular ways, that aren't going to stand up to it, and as a matter of fact, aren't going to stand up for black people at a certain point. So that's one of the things that he was doing. Also going to go into some of his politics. You guys look into this. So Bill Clinton and the crime bill, I'm not going to go into it, that the 95 crime bill. I'm not going to get into that so much, right? Because that's, people are sort of beating that to death at nauseum. But what I do want to talk about is a couple of things that, Bill Clinton did. Sorry, guys. Actually hit the wrong button on my computer. One of the things that Bill Clinton did is, when he announces this, he's got something called the Stone Mountain moment, right? So Bill Clinton, back in, I believe it was 1995, actually 1992, at a correctional facility in Stone Mountain, makes a speech there from a prison. And he makes this speech at Stone Mountain for one reason and one reason only. Stone Mountain is considered the Mecca of white supremacy in the United States. And he does it from a prison in Stone Mountain because he's dog whistling to the white supremacists who he wants to vote for him. And he's basically he's saying that basically these black folks here, I'm not on their side. Conservative, racist, white Southern men, I'm with you, right? So he literally has this scene where it's him and like 2 or 3 other sort of people in the administration, and they, right behind them are, like 20 prisoners, right? All dressed in prison garb. And it's reminiscent of a colonial photo or a photo from slavery. And he's definitely sort of dog whistling to these white people that he wants their votes, right? So that was trash. Also, we know that not only that symbolism or this thing that Bill Clinton is doing with taking this photo with these imprisoned black men behind him is being important, but you have to understand that the crime bill led to the imprisonment of all of these black men. So Hillary Clinton's super predator statement, Bill Clinton leading this crime bill, this is all impacted by this pseudoscience that said, I can't remember the guy's name, but there was a criminologist who said that America was on the verge of facing this onslaught from super predators, criminals who were on their way. And that he studied this, and that black on black crime was going to become worse, and black on white crime was going to become worse, and they had to bring black people to heel before this happened. You can look all of this up, right? So the idea was that they had to do things to neutralize this pending threat. They talked about us as being godless in this man's literature, his research. These young people were godless. They were animalistic. They were almost like alien in nature. Look all of this up. All of this really sort of dehumanizing language when talking about black people in order to be able to get this crime bill passed. And we know the implications of this crime bill, that we have more people in prison now than we did in slavery, at the end of slavery, right? In 1865, right? So at this point, we know that it had this impact of having millions upon millions of black men actually in prison, destroying our communities. Black women too, but by and large, black men. In addition to that, the other thing that he did is he passed a series of legislation having to do with welfare reform that people don't talk about. So when we had welfare, and people could be on welfare indefinitely at one point. I don't think that was actually in our best interest. But the changes that were made were punitive, and they actually have had negative impacts on black folks now. So one of the changes that he made is that if you had a prison record, that you were no longer eligible for welfare benefits. As a matter of fact, if you had actually gone to prison and you came out, you could no longer live in public housing, right? Or live with someone in public housing, right? If you had a drug conviction in particular, right? So you're looking at men who Bill Clinton puts in jail, right? And he comes up with this 3 strikes and you're out, and you've got people who are going to prison for the rest of their lives or for long stretches of time for minor drug offenses. He puts these people in jail, and when they get out now, right, when they finally get out of jail, and some of them are getting out within the last 10 years, right, they have no place to live, right? They're usually poor men who maybe lived with a grandmother or a mother or a girlfriend in public housing or a wife even, and they can't come back and live with these people because they've got this record. If you've been in jail for the last 10, 15, 20 years, where do you live if you have no money and no skills, right? So that was one. The other thing that he did as part of TANF in this legislation was that if you had a criminal conviction, you were not eligible for student aid, financial aid. So you have no place to live, and then as a poor man, you have no way to pay for an education to better your life, right? So you can't get an education because you can't pay for it, and you have no place to live, and often you can't get a job if you don't have an address. So what do you do? And we also know that people can choose not to hire you if you've got a criminal record. So you have a hard time getting a job. You have no place to live if you're a poor person. Everybody lives in public housing. And you have no way of bettering yourself or your station in life by getting an education because you don't have the money to pay for it. A friend of mine worked at one of these for-profit universities or colleges within the last 2 or 3 years, and she was telling me about a guy that she knew had just gotten out of prison. He'd been out of prison maybe 3 or 4 years, and he had to take these private loans because he couldn't get federal financial aid for this program, right, that he wanted to take. And he was living in his car. He had nobody that he could live with, and he was in debt, and he was paying for these classes, and it was a college where he was not really guaranteed to get a job because you have these predatory universities that are out there. And I think some of you guys know about this, how they had these universities where people were basically paying these ridiculous amounts of money to take these classes and these degrees that they could, really couldn't use later on, right? So they have all these mountains of debt, no degree often at the time of it, because they often can't finish the degree or pay for it. But if they did finish it and pay for it, they weren't even marketable after they'd invested in this way. So you've got these people who are trapped, basically. And what ends up happening is that, maybe they get caught staying with a wife or a girlfriend or a mother or a grandmother in public housing. She loses her public housing, right? Or, they're trying to find a way to make a living because everybody has to make a living. And they go back to crime. And what happens is they end up back in prison, and back in prison often for the rest of their lives. So this is the legacy of Bill Clinton. When a lot of us, are unable to find mates and sort of have the normal achievements of life, right? Or sort of the normal things that people expect in life, right? That, you go to school and you grow up, you go to school, you get married, you have children, and you have a life, right? Well, there's a lot of women in our community, and a lot of men too, who aren't having that normal life path because, I like to call our generation the generation of crack spinsters, right? Where, you have a lot of women who went to school, got an education, and there's no partners out there because of this machine, thanks to Bill Clinton. And I also say that, I tell people all the time that this game of liberal and conservative and Democrat and Republican is just that. It's a game that you have white supremacists, period. And what you have is you've got racism exists on a spectrum. You've got the polite racist or, sort of barely racist on one end of the spectrum. And you've got the people that, want us all dead on the other. And most white people exist somewhere in between, right? You've got good white folks, but they often are powerless, who don't agree with what's going on and are, in it with us and really are fighting. But because of the nature of the system, it makes it hard for them to sustain that. And they often don't get anywhere if they're not willing to play the game of white supremacy. So it makes it very hard for us to have true allies, right? So with that being said, you had the first George Bush and you had Ronald Reagan, who laid the groundwork for the drugs. When I was talking about my last video, laid this whole groundwork because they wanted to fund a war. And like I said, white supremacy never takes an opportunity or misses an opportunity to harm black people. So they dump all these drugs in our community. Bill Clinton then comes in and he cleans this up, but he cleans it up by making sure that we have 3 strikes and we're out, throwing away the men in our community, making sure that when they get out of prison, they have no way to make a living or to improve their life circumstances or pull themselves out of poverty, right? And it has all these implications for what we're seeing now with fatherlessness and homelessness and a lot of other things. I worked with students for a very long time, and I worked with this kid in high school with an Upward Bound program. And I remember going to a school in DC and recruiting this kid, really smart kid. And he came to our summer program. He was really determined to come to the summer program and stay on campus for 6 weeks. One day, this woman that I thought it was his mom pulls me aside and she tells me that he does not have, his parents are both in jail. They're both in prison for drugs. And he stays with her sometimes. He was a friend of her daughter's, so she would allow him to stay with her. This is a 13-year-old kid or a 13-year-old kid. She allowed him to stay with her at times, but she said often he lived with an older man that was in the neighborhood that would let him sleep on the couch, and he would say it was his grandfather, but it wasn't his grandfather. This kid had nobody because we have a system that doesn't care about us. It doesn't care about our kids. As a matter of fact, worse than not caring about us, it actually seeks to harm us and destroy us. And I think a lot of us are in real denial about that. So the legislation that these people come up with the Bill Clintons, who were supposed to be our allies and our friends, and the Joe Bidens come up with, is legislation that's designed to harm us, to be really punitive and hurt us. And then on the other end, you have people who just blatantly ignore us. And I'm going to say this as someone who's been a lifelong Democrat up until very recently. When I look at this, I don't know who's more harmful to us. I think often it's the Democrats because they masquerade as friends and because they get on TV and play a saxophone, right? or they come to our parties, or, want to do our dances with us, or whatever it is, we think that they don't mean us harm. They come with smiles, when the Republicans are much more naked about it, and they're very direct and clear about where it is they stand and how they feel about us. So in my mind, I like to see my enemy coming, right? You can't smile in my face and pretend to be my friend while you're stabbing me in the back and you're doing things to ruin and destroy my community. So that's Bill Clinton in a nutshell. I think, again, him getting up and sort of making this comment, he's in no moral position to judge our leaders and our activists, being that Bill Clinton has done single-handedly, has done more to harm the Black community than anybody since Reconstruction, the end of Reconstruction, right? That's who Bill Clinton is. So anyway, folks, I invite you to look into this, just look at the implications of TANF. That was the welfare reform that was passed, and some of the in particular, look at student loans, and look at the housing having to do with drugs and the drug war, and see how this all tied into each other, right? This crime bill and TANF, and look at the impact on our communities. So anyway, with that said, I'm gonna end the video, and I'm gonna be dressed again because I owe you a couple of other videos. There's a few things I want to talk about this evening. So anyway, folks, I hope that you're well, and I'll talk to you soon.